The fluorescent lights of Miller's diner buzzed overhead with that persistent electrical hum that never quite disappeared, no matter how many times someone called maintenance, and Sarah Mitchell was pretty sure that sound would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, assuming she ever got enough sleep to actually dream anymore. She'd been on her feet for 11 hours straight, her second double shift this week, and the ache in her lower back had progressed from a dull throb to what felt like someone had taken a baseball bat to her spine and decided to really commit to the swing. The dinner rush had been brutal. A tour bus full of seniors had rolled through around 6 and stayed until 9, ordering everything on the menu and leaving behind a collective tip that barely covered her gas money for the week. And now it was pushing 11 at night, with just one customer left, nursing his 4th cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie he'd been working on for the better part of an hour. Her phone sat on the back counter near the coffee station, its screen dark but somehow still menacing, because she knew what was waiting for her when she finally checked it. 3 missed calls from her babysitter, Miss Chen, 2 text messages she was too terrified to open, and probably a voicemail that would start with those words she'd been dreading all week. The rent was due yesterday, not tomorrow or next week, but yesterday, and her landlord, Mr. Kovac, had made it crystal clear during their last interaction that he was done being understanding about her situation. Her daughter Emma was 6 months old now, premature by 5 weeks and still catching up developmentally, which meant more doctor visits, more specialists, more co-pays that her insurance barely touched, and formula that cost more per ounce than the coffee she'd been serving all day. The father, if you could even call him that, had vanished the moment he saw the positive pregnancy test, blocked her number and moved to another state according to his sister, who at least had the decency to look ashamed when she delivered that particular piece of information. Sarah wiped down the counter for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, her hands moving on autopilot while her mind ran through calculations that never quite added up, no matter how many times she rearranged the numbers. She had $47 in her checking account, another $12.63 in tips from today sitting in her apron pocket, mostly in singles and quarters, and Emma needed formula by tomorrow morning, or things were going to get very complicated very quickly. The last customer finally signaled for his check, and Sarah forced her face into something resembling a smile as she rang him up, watching him count out exact change with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he either didn't notice or didn't care that she'd been standing there waiting to close up and go home for the past 20 minutes. The automatic doors of the 24-hour pharmacy slid open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded uncomfortably final, like a coffin ceiling or a bank vault locking, and Sarah stepped into the blast of air conditioning that made her shiver in her thin uniform, despite the fact that it was 78 degrees outside. The pharmacy was one of those massive chain stores that sold everything from birthday cards to motor oil, staffed at this hour by exactly 2 employees, who both looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet, and the fluorescent lights were somehow even more aggressive than the ones at the diner, bright enough that she had to squint as her eyes adjusted. She knew exactly where the baby formula was, aisle 7 halfway down on the left, because she'd been making this trip twice a week for the past 6 months, and the layout of this store was burned into her memory with the kind of detail usually reserved for traumatic events. The formula Emma needed wasn't the cheap stuff, of course it wasn't, because her daughter had reflux issues that meant regular formula came back up almost as fast as it went down, so they needed the special hypoallergenic kind that cost $43 for a container that lasted maybe 5 days. If Sarah stretched the measurements and supplemented with the cheaper stuff when she thought she could get away with it, she stood in front of the shelf now staring at the price tags like maybe if she looked hard enough the numbers would rearrange themselves into something manageable, her hand unconsciously moving to her apron pocket, where her tips sat in a crumpled mess of bills and coins that she already knew wouldn't be enough. Behind her she could hear the squeak of shopping cart wheels, the beep of the self-checkout scanners, the tinny overhead music playing some pop song from 5 years ago that she'd probably heard 10,000 times but couldn't name if someone offered her $100. She did the math again faster this time. $43 for the formula minus the $12.63 in her apron minus the $47 in her checking account meant she was short exactly. No, wait. She'd forgotten about the overdraft fees from last week when the electric bill hit before her paycheck cleared. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for one of the containers, the plastic cool and smooth under her fingers, and she wondered for probably the 1000th time how she'd ended up here, 23 years old with a 6-month-old baby and a life that seemed determined to crush her under its weight, no matter how hard she fought. The rational part of her brain, the part that wasn't running on 4 hours of sleep and pure caffeine, knew that she should put the formula back and figure something else out, call the church program that sometimes helped or see if the food bank had any samples. But Emma needed to eat in the morning, and those options would take time she didn't have. She made her way to the front of the store, the formula container clutched against her chest like a life preserver, joining the line behind a man in an expensive-looking suit who was buying a single bottle of water and a pack of antacids, probably some business traveler whose biggest problem tonight was indigestion from whatever fancy restaurant he'd just left. The cashier was a kid probably still in high school, working the midnight shift for minimum wage, and looking like he wanted to be literally anywhere else. His name tag, identifying him as Brandon, with a little smiley face sticker someone had added that felt aggressively ironic given his expression. He scanned the formula without comment, the electronic beep sounding unusually loud in Sarah's ears, and the register display lit up with numbers that made her stomach clench even though she'd known exactly what they'd be, $43.27 with tax, and she started pulling out the crumpled bills from her apron pocket, smoothing them one by one on the counter like that might somehow make them multiply. A 5, 3 ones, another 5, 4 more ones, the bills coming out in no particular order, because she'd just shoved them in there throughout the shift without organizing anything, and Brandon waited with the kind of patient exhaustion that suggested this wasn't even close to the weirdest thing he'd dealt with tonight. The man in the expensive suit had moved off to the side after paying for his water and antacids, but Sarah was vaguely aware that he hadn't left, that he was still standing there near the magazine rack, pretending to look at the cover of some business publication while obviously watching what was happening at the register. She got to $23 in bills, and then started on the coins, dumping the entire contents of her apron pocket onto the counter in a cascade of quarters, dimes, nickels and pennies that rolled and scattered across the surface. Brandon helped her corral them without being asked, his expression shifting from bored to something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Sarah wasn't sure which and wasn't sure it mattered. She started counting out loud because somehow that made it feel more manageable, organizing the quarters into stacks of 4 to make dollars. 25, 50, 75, $1, 25, 50, 75, $2, the mechanical process giving her something to focus on besides the growing line behind her and the awareness that she was absolutely that person right now, the one holding everyone up while counting pennies. The people behind her were getting restless. She could feel it without turning around, could hear the subtle shifts of weight and the quiet sighs that people make when they're trying to be polite about being annoyed but want you to know they're annoyed anyway. She got to $38.50 and then there was nothing left to count, her apron pocket turned inside out and completely empty, the counter covered in neat stacks of coins and crumpled bills that still weren't enough. Brandon looked at the register display, then at her pile of money, then back at the display, doing math that wasn't particularly complicated but still took him a moment. $4.77 short, he said quietly, and Sarah felt something crack inside her chest because she'd known it would be close, but some stupid, desperate part of her had hoped. Maybe she'd miscounted, maybe there was enough after all. She opened her mouth to say something, probably to apologize and tell him never mind, she'd put it back, but her throat had closed up and no words would come out, and she was horrified to realize that her eyes were burning with tears that she absolutely could not let fall, because if she started crying in this pharmacy at midnight in front of all these people she might actually never stop. The man in the expensive suit stepped forward before Sarah could gather up her money and leave, and she was suddenly very aware of how close he was, close enough that she could smell his cologne, which was probably more expensive than her entire outfit, including her shoes. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was quiet, but had that quality of someone used to being listened to, someone whose words carried weight in boardrooms and conference calls. He pulled out a wallet that looked like it cost more than Sarah made in a month, soft black leather worn smooth from use, but still clearly expensive, and extracted a credit card with the kind of casual ease that suggested money was not something he spent much time thinking about. I'll cover the difference, he said to Brandon, and then turned to Sarah with an expression that was hard to read, not pity exactly, but something more complex, something that included understanding, and maybe a touch of sadness, that seemed out of place on his well-fed, well-rested face. Sarah opened her mouth to protest because that's what you were supposed to do in this situation, refuse the help and maintain whatever dignity you had left, but he held up one hand in a gentle gesture that stopped her before she could get the words out. Please, and there was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't about her at all, or at least not entirely, that he needed to do this for reasons that had nothing to do with charity, or pity or any of the other words that were currently bouncing around in Sarah's exhausted brain. Brandon took the credit card and ran it through without comment, clearly relieved that the situation was resolving itself without drama or the need to call a manager, and the receipt printed with a mechanical whir that seemed unnaturally loud. The man signed it with a pen that probably also cost more than Sarah made in a week, and then he did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone, one of those latest model smartphones that had just come out and probably cost $1,000, and opened up some kind of delivery app. "What's your address?" he asked Sarah, and she was so confused by the question that she actually answered, rattling off the apartment number and street name before her brain caught up with her mouth. He tapped on the screen for a moment, his expression focused and businesslike, and then showed her what he'd done. He'd ordered 6 containers of the same formula she'd just bought, scheduled for delivery tomorrow morning, already paid for with a tip that was probably more than the actual cost of the formula. "I have a daughter," he said quietly, and something in his expression shifted, became more human and less like a statue of success in an expensive suit. "She's grown now, living in Seattle, but I remember those early days. I remember feeling like I was drowning and I had every advantage in the world. I can't imagine doing it alone." Sarah was definitely crying now, tears running down her face that she didn't bother trying to hide anymore because what was the point, and she wanted to say something profound or meaningful, but all that came out was a choked thank you that didn't even begin to cover what she was feeling. They walked out of the pharmacy together in an awkward silence that was somehow more comfortable than small talk would have been. Sarah clutching the formula container, like it might disappear. She loosened her grip, and the man whose name she still didn't know walking beside her, with his hands in his pockets like he didn't have anywhere more important to be at midnight on a Wednesday. The parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, just a handful of cars scattered under the harsh white lights that made everything look washed out and slightly unreal, and Sarah headed toward her car, which was a 15-year-old Honda Civic that was currently held together by duct tape, prayer, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. The man stopped next to a black luxury sedan that probably cost more than Sarah would make in 5 years, and she wondered if he was going to get in and drive away, if this strange intersection of their lives was already over. But instead he pulled out another business card from his wallet and held it out to her. "My name is Michael Chen," he said, and Sarah's brain stuttered over the last name because that was her babysitter's last name, but that had to be a coincidence because Mrs. Chen had never mentioned having a son who looked like he owned half the city. "I'm the CEO of Pacific Northwest Foods," he continued, and Sarah vaguely recognized the name as one of those regional grocery chains that had been expanding lately, the kind of place where everything cost twice what it did at the discount stores she usually shopped at. The business card was heavy, expensive cardstock with embossed lettering, and it had multiple phone numbers, including one labeled personal, which seemed wildly inappropriate to give to a random stranger you just met in a pharmacy. "I'm not giving you this because I want something from you," Michael said, and his expression was serious now, all business despite the late hour and the strange circumstances. "I'm giving it to you because 23 years ago, I was exactly where you are right now, single father with a baby daughter, working 3 jobs, and wondering how I was going to make it to next week, let alone next year. And someone helped me, someone gave me a chance I didn't deserve, and couldn't repay, and I've spent the last 2 decades looking for ways to pay it forward." Sarah looked at the card, then at him, then back at the card, her tired brain trying to process what he was saying, and failing to make the pieces fit together in any logical way. "We're hiring at the corporate office," he said, and pulled out his phone again, pulling up what looked like a job listing. "Administrative assistant position, full benefits including health insurance, on-site childcare at a subsidized rate. Starting salary is $45,000, which I know isn't a fortune, but it's probably better than what you're making now, and there's room for advancement if you're willing to work hard. He showed her the screen, and Sarah stared at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language, because $45,000 a year was more than double what she made at the diner, and health insurance meant she could actually take Emma to all those specialist appointments without having to choose between medical care and grocery. "This isn't charity," Michael said firmly, and his expression had shifted into something that might have been his CEO face, authoritative and non-negotiable. "I saw how you handled yourself in there, counting every penny, refusing to give up even when you knew the numbers didn't add up. That's exactly the kind of problem-solving determination I need in my organization, and honestly, you'd be doing me a favor because good employees are hard to find." Sarah didn't sleep that night, not because Emma woke up crying, though she did that too around 3 in the morning, but because her brain wouldn't stop running through every possible angle of what had just happened, trying to find the catch or the scam or whatever dark reality was hiding behind what seemed like an impossible stroke of luck. She sat at her kitchen table, which was really just a folding card table she'd bought at a thrift store, the business card positioned in front of her like a tarot card that might reveal her future if she stared at it long enough, and watched the sun come up through her apartment's thin curtains that didn't quite close all the way. The formula delivery had arrived at 7 in the morning, exactly like Michael had promised. 6 containers in a box with a note that just said "You've got this" in handwriting that somehow managed to look both expensive and genuine, and Sarah had stood in her doorway holding the box and crying for the second time in 12 hours, which had to be some kind of record. She made coffee in the ancient Mr. Coffee machine that was one of 3 kitchen appliances she owned, the others being a microwave from 2008, and a toaster that only worked if you held down the lever manually, and tried to think through her options with something resembling logic instead of emotion. The smart thing would be to ignore the card, to chalk last night up to a weird moment of kindness from a stranger, and continue grinding through her life at the diner until something better came along through normal channels. But Sarah had been waiting for something better through normal channels for 23 years, and so far it hadn't shown up. The risky thing would be to call the number on the card, to show up at some corporate office and hope that Michael Chen had been serious about the job offer, and not just making empty promises to make himself feel better about being rich. But risk was relative when you were already at rock bottom and the only direction left was up. Emma started fussing in her bassinet, that pre-crying sound that meant she'd be fully awake in about 30 seconds, and Sarah went through the familiar morning routine of diaper change, formula prep, feeding time, while staring at the wall and wondering what her daughter's life would look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20. Would Emma remember these days in this terrible apartment? Would she have vague memories of her mother always being tired and stressed? Or would these just be blank years that didn't register because babies didn't form long-term memories yet? Sarah picked up her phone, Michael's business card still on the table where she'd been staring at it for the past 2 hours, and she thought about her daughter's future, and her own future, and how maybe they could be something better than what she'd planned for. She thought about the look on Michael's face in the pharmacy, not pity but recognition, like he'd seen himself in her situation, and wanted to offer the same kind of help he'd apparently received 2 decades ago. And she thought about how everyone always said you make your own luck, but sometimes maybe luck makes you first and then you decide what to do with it. She dialed the personal number on the card at 8 in the morning exactly, her hands shaking slightly but her voice steady when Michael answered on the second ring with a hello that sounded alert and professional despite the early hour. The Pacific Northwest Foods corporate office was located in one of those downtown buildings with more glass than wall, the kind of place where everything looked expensive and intentional, and completely foreign to someone who'd spent the last year measuring her life in increments of tips and shift hours. Sarah had borrowed a blazer from Mrs. Chen, who turned out to be Michael's mother, and had reacted to the news of last night's pharmacy encounter with knowing satisfaction, and a comment about her son finally using his success for something meaningful. And underneath the blazer, Sarah wore the only non-diner clothes she owned that weren't stained or torn, a simple black dress she'd bought for her high school graduation and had somehow managed to fit into again after 6 months of the exhaustion diet. The lobby had one of those modern reception desks made of reclaimed wood and brushed metal, and the receptionist had looked at Sarah with an expression that clearly said she didn't belong there but was too professional to say it out loud, at least until Sarah mentioned Michael's name, and the woman's entire demeanor had shifted into something resembling respect mixed with curiosity. Emma was asleep in her carrier, which was either incredible luck or the universe finally deciding to cut Sarah a break, and they'd been ushered into a conference room that had a view of the city that probably cost more in rent per month than Sarah's entire apartment. Michael arrived with a woman he introduced as Jennifer Park, the HR director, who had the kind of competent energy that suggested she could organize a military invasion before lunch and still have time to respond to all her emails. They spent the next hour talking, not in the awkward question and answer format Sarah had been dreading, but in something that felt more like a conversation between people trying to figure out if they could work together, and Sarah found herself being more honest than she'd planned to be about her situation, about Emma, and the absent father, and the struggle to make ends meet, and the feeling that she was constantly one disaster away from complete collapse. Jennifer took notes on a tablet with quick, efficient movements, while Michael mostly listened, occasionally asking questions that seemed designed to understand not just what Sarah could do but who she was as a person, whether she had the kind of resilience and adaptability that couldn't be taught in any training program. They discussed the practical detail, the salary, which was actually $48,000, not $45, the benefits package that included health insurance with a deductible Sarah could actually afford, the on-site childcare that operated from 6 in the morning until 7 at night and cost a fraction of what she'd been paying Mrs. Chen, and the position itself, which involved coordinating between different departments and managing schedules and handling the kind of organizational chaos that apparently was constant in a growing company. "Can you start Monday?" Jennifer asked, and Sarah laughed before she could stop herself because it was Friday morning and Monday was only 3 days away. But then she realized the question was serious and they were both looking at her expectantly. She thought about the diner, about giving her 2 weeks' notice to a manager who'd probably told her good riddance because finding waitresses willing to work double shifts for minimum wage wasn't exactly difficult, and she thought about Emma growing up watching her mother fight and struggle and barely survive, versus watching her mother work hard and build something resembling a real career. "Yes," Sarah said, and the word came out stronger than she expected, carrying a weight of decision and commitment that felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the corporate office building, the nice bathroom on the executive floor that had actual hand lotion and didn't smell like industrial cleaner, and barely recognized the person looking back at her. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost during those desperate months. Her face had color again instead of that gray, exhausted pallor, and she was wearing clothes she'd bought new, not from a thrift store, professional outfits that made her feel like she might actually know what she was doing, even on days when she absolutely didn't. Emma was downstairs in the childcare center, probably destroying some educational toy with the single-minded determination that 6-month-olds brought to everything, and Sarah had just finished a meeting where she'd successfully coordinated a logistics problem that would have seemed impossibly complex 3 months ago but now felt almost manageable. The job was hard in completely different ways than the diner had been hard, mental exhaustion instead of physical, the kind of tired that came from learning new systems and making decisions that affected other people and trying to prove that Michael's faith in her hadn't been misplaced. She'd made mistakes, plenty of them, including one spectacular disaster in her second week that had involved double booking a conference room for 2 critical meetings and had required Jennifer to step in and fix before things got truly catastrophic. But nobody had fired her or told her she wasn't cut out for this. They'd just helped her figure out a system to prevent it from happening again, and moved on. Michael checked in with her, maybe once a week, always casual, and never making it feel like surveillance, just asking how she was settling in, and whether she needed anything, and once he'd mentioned seeing Emma in the childcare center and commenting on how much she'd grown, which had made Sarah realize that he actually paid attention to the details of her life despite running a company with hundreds of employees. The other night Sarah had done something she hadn't done in over a year. She'd gone grocery shopping without checking prices, had just put things in her cart based on whether she wanted them instead of calculating unit costs and comparing store brands, and when she'd gotten to the checkout and the total had been over $100, She'd paid with her debit card without that spike of panic about whether it would go through. She'd paid off 2 credit cards, caught up on her rent, and had even managed to put $300 into a savings account that she'd opened specifically because Jennifer had mentioned during orientation that the company matched retirement contributions, and Sarah should really take advantage of that. Small things, practical things, but they added up to a life that felt fundamentally different from the one she'd been living 6 months ago when she'd been counting pennies on a pharmacy counter and trying not to cry. She thought about that night sometime, about the specific sequence of events that had led to Michael Chen being in line behind her at exactly the right moment, and she still couldn't quite believe it had actually happened, that her life had changed so dramatically because of one stranger's decision to help instead of looking away. Emma was going to grow up with opportunities Sarah had never had, would go to good schools and have health insurance and maybe even go to college someday, and none of that would have been possible without that single moment of intervention. Sarah gathered her things and headed back to her desk, passing Michael in the hallway, who nodded at her with that slight smile that suggested he knew exactly what she was thinking, and she wondered if maybe paying it forward wasn't about grand gestures but about noticing when someone needed help and having the courage to offer it, about recognizing yourself in someone else's struggle and deciding that you had the power to change their story just like someone had once changed yours.